Our first presenter is Scott Commoners from Harvard. Take it away, 15 minutes.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very honored to be presenting at the first edition of this conference. This is joint work with Mohammed Akbarpour and Piotr Dvorak on redistributive allocation mechanisms. Sort of usual commentary, particularly for this research agenda. You should give more than 2/3 of the credit to my co-authors, because in some Shapley value sense, sort of all of this stuff could have happened without me, but none of it could have happened without either of them. So very good. What's our setting? We're going to be thinking about allocation in contexts where non-market mechanisms are used, even though monetary transfers are available. And if you think about it for a moment, these are pervasive. We see it in the context of housing, with governments running sort of public housing programs, both at local and national levels. We see it in healthcare. We see it in food. This is like in-kind redistribution, things like food stamps. Road access is always an interesting example, because it's one where economists famously think there should be a market mechanism, and governments and policymakers frequently choose not to institute one. Congestion pricing is sort of uniformly agreed. It would be like efficiency enhancing, and you hear arguments like, but we don't want to make the roads only the option, the sort of roads at peak times only available to wealthy people. And you could argue, oh, but it might even be a Pareto improvement, and yet still you see policymakers shutting down congestion pricing schemes. Other cases in the United States, there's full rationing for national park permits, and then very recently, the U.S. and many other countries used non-market mechanisms to allocate vaccines. Footnote: I should advertise there'll be more using this framework to talk about vaccines on Thursday. So while I reference it a little bit, we have sort of a fully built out application based around that particular case. But the question is, like, why not use a market mechanism, which would potentially lead to more efficient outcomes? And a very common and natural answer is that there are redistributive concerns. You care not just about getting sort of the maximum value of the goods, but you care about the distribution, who actually receives the value. So what we're going to give in this paper is a market design framework for optimal allocation under redistributive concerns. Footnote, of course, this is like, leaving aside the possibility of doing macro level redistribution. We're imagining you're a policymaker or a marketplace organizer who just controls or regulates that one market. So you can't maximize productivity and then tax. You have to actually, sort of effect whatever redistribution you want in the market you control. The designer is going to be allocating goods of heterogeneous quality to agents who differ in both observable and unobservable characteristics. We're going to solve the optimal mechanism design problem subject to incentive and individual rationality constraints. And crucially, we're going to have a welfare function that reflects the redistributive concern through heterogeneous welfare weights. And what we're going to show is that the key factors that drive sort of market-based redistribution are the relationship between the social preferences and the observability of agents' characteristics. So the extent to which you can actually learn about the characteristics you care about for redistribution from agents' behavior under the mechanism. How revenue generated by the mechanism is used. So sometimes you might want to run an efficient market simply because you can raise enough money in doing so that you can then sort of effect a very sort of efficient transfer to the people you care about the most. And then lastly, it's actually going to depend on the types of goods as well. So we're going to see more redistribution of universally desirable goods. And I'll go into a little bit more detail about what that means, but you should think about it as, often representing essential goods like food or housing or healthcare, something that, would be desirable to everybody. And so in particular, if someone chooses to forego it, chooses not to consume it, we infer that that's much more likely to be sort of about their wealth or ability to pay than necessarily their demand. This plugs into massive and multifarious literatures. The entire concept of mechanism design with redistributive concerns is standing on the shoulders of giants. There's an incredible paper by Marty Weitzman from the 70s that sort of set out this idea. Methodologically, we're building a lot on this more recent paper by Condarelli, and also to some degree on our prior work called Redistribution Through Markets. Also plugs in with a bunch of other sort of, public finance and price control questions, in-kind redistribution, auctions under budget constraints, sort of other mechanisms where you hit sort of sharp edge constraints. And then, methodologically plugs in with screening and generalized ironing. Okay, so what's going on? We're going to imagine that we're allocating a unit mass of objects to a unit mass of agents. Each object's going to have a quality, Q and 0, 1. And agents are going to have a three-dimensional type. So there's an observable component. So this might be your profession or your neighborhood, sort of some public marker. There's an unobserved willingness to pay. So this is what we're going to be trying to elicit through the mechanism. So this is your willingness to pay for quality. And then there's going to be lambda, which is an unobserved social welfare weight. And we're going to care about lambda for the purposes of allocation. And your type is going to be sort of informative about lambda. So the designer knows the type distribution, but then there's this sort of welfare skew, I guess. If an agent of type IR lambda receives a good with quality Q and pays T, she gets utility QR minus T, and her contribution to social welfare is lambda times that. So your welfare contribution, is weighted by lambda, but remember lambda is unobserved. So we're going to be trying to learn about lambda using what we can see and what we learn about your type through the mechanism. So market designer uses arbitrary direct allocation mechanisms, standard mechanism design framework. There's nothing unusual on this slide. You get to choose a probability of allocation to agents of each types, subject to feasibility, incentive, individual rationality, and no subsidy constraints. And the designer is going to maximize a weighted sum of revenue and utility. So the designer sort of both cares about this weighted utility and then also possibly revenue with a weight alpha. And so that weight alpha, as I mentioned, is actually going to plug into the question of what is optimal. Because we're going to sort of think about whether there's a revenue objective that's either sort of designer level, sort of collecting revenue as a company, say, or public, like is alpha being used to buy a public good for the people in the market or something of the sort. And sort of the key insight here and in our prior work is that the designer is going to be forming expectations over the social welfare weights, given what they see in the market. So the designer can't observe lambda directly, and instead what they're going to sort of quote unquote observe is the expectation of lambda given the observable and revealed information. And what does that mean economically? It means that the designer is in some sense estimating agents' need, right? So if you think of lambda as representing the extent to which you want to transfer value to that agent, you can think of this as their need. Or their value for money, like how much do we socially weight giving 1 unit of util to that agent? We can learn this in 2 ways, right? We can learn this from what we can observe about you. We might know that you live in a less privileged area, or that you're in a profession that we particularly place social weight on. So think about vaccines. We might place a really high social welfare weight on doctors. Both because they are putting themselves at risk and that they are helping other people. So we might care a lot about, sort of shifting welfare to doctors. That could all depend on right? Those are observable things, your neighborhood, your profession, but also elicitable information. So your relative need, your willingness to pay for something also reveals information about your type, and it might reveal something about how much we want to contribute to you, right? And so what this is going to mean is that the optimal allocation rule is going to depend on the statistical correlation of the labels and the willingness to pay with the unobserved social welfare weights. So our ability to do sort of optimal redistributive allocation depends on how much we learn about lambda from the information we observe and elicit. Footnote on techniques. I'm not going to go into this much in the talk, but there's some really beautiful mathematical machinery that makes it possible to find the optimal mechanism in a really clean way. It has sort of a very natural structure. First thing that's happening is basically objects of the different quality levels are allocated across the groups. So you sort of split the the objects across the groups, and then within group, they're allocated, sort of under some optimal allocation rule. And what's going on? Like, how are we choosing this split? We're sort of like, we're being greedy. We're trying to always maximize the marginal expected social return of the marginal quality unit across groups, right? So we basically like compute the optimal within group allocation for each group, and then you apportion out the quality levels to maximize the marginal return conditional on what you're going to be doing within group. So more, sort of more of that in the paper and or in longer versions of the talk, but suffice it to say, it's really clean and it's a greedy algorithm, which is what you would expect. You're greedy with respect to marginal social welfare, again, under these expected welfare weights. And so from there, the real sort of economic substance is we can extract out intuition about when you want to use in-kind redistribution versus not. So first of all, let's be formally precise. In-kind redistribution is going to be random allocation of the good at some range of quality levels, at below market prices. So we're going to basically have rationing at prices that are fixed, below the market clearing level, possibly at zero. And roughly what you want to do with this is when we can observe things that let us uncover inequality in the welfare weights. So when we can sort of use the information in the market to discover inequality that we would like to sort of address through redistribution. So one case is what we call label revealed inequality. This is when the average Pareto weight on a given group exceeds the weight on revenue. So you can think of this weight on revenue alpha as representing like what the social value of just like collecting $1 of revenue is. If the social value of sort of transferring utility to a group is higher than that, then you want at least some kind of in-kind redistribution, so long as the good itself is sufficiently valuable. And this is going to be this universal desirability I mentioned, right? You don't want to use in-kind redistribution for things that some people just don't want. You'd much rather you'd much rather raise revenue for them. But at least in the extent that that an entire group wants something, and again, think about essential goods like food or housing, then you actually want in-kind redistribution simply if you can observe that the average welfare weight within a group is high. And this gives a really strong justification for for policies like food stamps, right? You're not worried about a small number of people receiving food stamps who don't need them, because the vast majority of people who receive them really, really need them. So the average welfare weight is super high. The other context, incidentally, where you want to do this in-kind redistribution is when you have inequality that's revealed through willingness to pay. So this is when welfare weights are strongly negatively correlated with willingness to pay. So you see someone not willing to pay for something, you infer that they must be really in need. So this is like, life-saving medical treatment. If somebody chooses to not buy a life-saving medical treatment, our inference is that person, is probably not choosing not to buy it because they prefer not to have it, but rather that they just do not have the means. And so that's a second case where in-kind redistribution is really important. The flip side of that, in the last 2 minutes, is when to use market mechanisms. That is, when do you want to actually use market clearing prices to do assortative matching on quality? And roughly that's when either revenue or efficiency dominates versus redistributive concerns. Now that's like almost tautological the way I just said it, but precisely what is this? So sometimes you're actually trying to maximize revenue, and that might be, again, because you as the firm just place a high weight on revenue, or it might be because you as the social planner have a really efficient way to use it relative to the average Pareto weight. So think allocating goods to corporations when the Pareto weights might be low, or when you can use lump sum transfers or some really sort of efficient public good. And then secondarily, efficiency maximization, which is here when the welfare weights are not strongly correlated with willingness to pay. So perfect. So that's when you have a small dispersion in welfare weights to begin with, or a large dispersion but little correlation with willingness to pay. Right. So if there's no inequality, then you want a market allocation. Or also, if you learn nothing from willingness to pay about inequality, think it's like milk or something where you're not willing to buy it, doesn't really symbolize need, but more likely symbolizes a choice of taste. Then there's nothing we can do. We can't use the market to redistribute it in an effective way. And so you might as well use an efficient allocation. All right, so that's the story. We introduced a model of optimal allocation under general redistributive concerns and highlighted 3 different factors that sort of drive when you want to do in-kind redistribution. And there's far more to think about in this space. I mentioned we're going to do an application that sort of like uses a version of this model to, with externalities to talk about vaccines 2 days from now. But there's tons of stuff about this model that is sort of like, very, very first cut-ish relative to how we think about redistribution. Especially, it's very ex ante, and we often care about ex post fairness, especially in an audience like today's. It's also very linear, and we tend to think, especially for populations that are at risk, linearity is not a good assumption, right? Income effects matter, risk aversion matters, ability to invest matters. And then, of course, like all of this lives in a broader environment of like classical economic models of redistribution, and we haven't said anything about how this relates. Cool. QED, thanks so much.